Hey friends, what's up? Happy Friday and welcome back to another episode of Stab and Stitch. So every week I hop on here and I work on a little project that I've been working on. This is this week's project. And I tell you a true crime story. Makers, grab your projects and you can knit right along with me. And if you're not a maker, that's okay. You can just hang out for the story. But if you're new here, hi. It's nice to meet you. My name's Emily. I'm DIY My Way over on Instagram. And if you don't already follow me there, you should check it out after the video. So this week I am wearing one of my designs. It's actually in testing right now. Let me see if I can show you this without messing up my mic. So this is the Dream and Plaid Infinity Scarf. There's a couple ways you can make it. You can make it where each row is its own color, or you can do like I did for this sample and use a variegated skein. So I used one of the Karen Cakes skeins for this, and it gave me this like awesome coffee color thing that my cat loves apparently. But this honestly reminds me of like coffee or maybe like hot chocolate with marshmallows on top. I don't know. But I love it. And this pattern I'm planning to release on January 9th, 2021. So if you're a crocheter, just save your scraps from holiday making because this is honestly a great stash buster project. So what I'm working on tonight is also one of my patterns. It has not been released yet, and honestly, I'm not sure if I'm going to release it or not. It's my first sweater that I've like made for myself with like schematics and stuff, so I'm kind of just doing it to see if it like works, but TBD. So real quick before we jump in, if you have not subscribed already, go ahead and hit that button. I think it's on this side. So that you can see our stab and stitch every week and join in and have some fun. All right, so this week's story. I almost want to guarantee you haven't heard this one before. And I'm gonna go ahead and get started on this, but I'm not 100% sure. This one I actually did not see covered by any other podcasts. There's honestly not a lot out about it on YouTube, and I decided, you know what? I really want to dig in and figure this out because everything that I see from this calls these two guys Utah's first serial killers. But also they may not actually be serial killers. So we'll unpack that later. I want to start by telling you about Stephen Allen Shay. Stephen was born on April 7th in 1948. He grew up in Granger, Utah, which is kind of a suburb of Salt Lake City. It's a little bit outside of the city, honestly, like a pretty nice neighborhood from what I read. He graduated high school in June of 1966 at the age of 17. And he was working at a service station, which is what they called gas stations back then, to save up money for his future. You know, he wanted to go to college, all of those things, but had taken a year to work first to save the money. It's December 17th in 1966, and Steve was working the night shift, which at gas stations back then, and the reason they were called service stations, the attendant actually had to come out and help you fill up your car with gas. So you always had to have somebody working when it was open, and Steve would interact with every customer that came through while he was working, especially when he was working alone like he was that night. So as he's working that night, a car pulls up with two men inside. Steve approached the car just like you would with every customer, and instead of being met with a customer saying, you know, can you fill up my car with gas, Steve was met with a gun. The two men asked him to give them all the money that he had, which would be $147, and then kidnapped him by forcing him into the back of their car with the gun. It would be reported to police later that evening that it appeared that this gas station had been robbed and that Steve was not there. But Steve would not be found because, or at least not that night, because the two men forced him into their car and drove out into the desert. So they drive out into the desert with Steve. Once they're out there, they forced him to strip, and both men raped him. After that, they allegedly flipped a coin to decide who would, quote, have the honor of killing him, which I find really creepy, honestly. But they flipped the coin, and one man won, and he stabbed Steve 5 times in the chest with a knife, and then they left his body there, naked, on the side of a dirt road. What police and the community didn't know at the time was that Steve was just the first of 6 people who would be killed in a 5-day killing spree by his murderer, Walter Kelbach, and his partner in crime, and maybe also in life, Myron Lance. Let's unpack a little bit. So Walter Kelbach and Myron Lance were both ex-convicts. They had been in Utah State Prison, and Lance was the most recently released, being released in September of 1965. So they were on parole, and they were actually cousins. It's also said that the 2 men were lovers. Now, I'm just going to preface this by saying a lot of the more scandalous information about these 2 is kind of hard to pin down, because this happened in the 1960s. And in the 1960s, you didn't just print things like this in the newspaper or say it on TV. Like, this was very much not the same time as the 2000s are. So it was alleged that the 2 men were homosexuals. It's also said that the 2 men abused drugs and alcohol together. So they were allegedly hopped up that night on pills and wine. And that's a quote from a report that I saw. Now, like I said, they didn't report stuff like this in the papers in the 60s. So it's really hard to substantiate these claims of whether or not the 2 men were sober or not when this happened. But I don't think that's as important as what happened next. So the other thing to know about the 60s and the late 60s is that this was really the first time that like news on TV was a thing. And this was one of the first major crimes that had happened in Utah since this was a thing. So when Steve Shay's body was discovered the next morning, the news was on the scene. And on the news that day, it was plastered all over, that there had been this gruesome murder. Somebody was stabbed 5 times in the chest. Like, that's not a pretty picture. And they were interviewing the police, and this was before police were like frequently interviewed on TV about crimes. So they were very candid about the details, which of course caused a public panic. People had never been faced with something like this before, and they really didn't know what to do. This was a time where you didn't necessarily lock your doors at night, but you can almost bet that every single person that watched the news had locked their doors that night. So the public found out about this on December 18th. That same night, Walter and Myron struck again. I cannot say his name for the life of me. Kelbach and Lance struck again. Their MO was almost exactly the same as Steve Shay's death. They went to a gas station at night where 18-year-old Michael Holtz was working. He was just a year older than Steve and was still in high school, would be graduating in May of 1967, or he would have. Just like Steve, they robbed him and kidnapped him, driving him out to a different location where he was stripped. Both men raped him, and then this time, Lance won the coin flip, and murdered him with what is believed to be the same weapon that was used to kill Steve. They left his body by the side of the highway, so it was a little bit less out of the way this time, from my understanding, but almost exactly the same MO. So police very, very quickly connected the 2 murders. There was no question that these were the same perpetrator or perpetrators. They didn't know at the time that it was 2 people, right? Because security cameras weren't really a thing back then. But at this point, the public lost it. The Utah governor actually issued a warning to citizens saying, if you see something, say something. And the news was covered with interviews with police officers who, like I said, were being very candid. One officer was asked by the reporter, "Do you think it could happen again?" And his response was, "Well, it's already happened twice," which very much freaked people out. There was a citywide order released to close all gas stations at nightfall. So, like, major changes in the community because of these crimes. And this, I think, was before PR and press conferences were, like, a huge thing. because the police didn't really seem to take any measures to try to control the panic of the community. Every news clip that I saw of this, or like thing that I read in the newspapers, were pretty explicit with what had happened. They did keep, the sexual assault out of it. And that was reserved for medical examiners' reports and things like that. But they were pretty candid about what was going on. Business owners especially panicked. They were arming themselves. They hired security for things that were remaining open at night. Just all sorts of protection measures taken. Now, it would be 3 days before there was another killing in these murders. And for all of the protective measures taken, they really didn't do a whole lot of good because the killers changed their MO this time. Their next victim wouldn't be an attendant at a gas station or service station, but instead a taxi driver who was unfortunate enough to pick up the pair. They were allegedly headed towards the airport when they got in this taxi, and it's said that very quickly Grant Strong, the taxi driver, knew something wasn't quite right with these two passengers. He discreetly communicated it to his supervisors. Some reports say he actually stopped by the station. Others say he discreetly radioed it in. I feel like that's a little more likely, but I don't know. But they had decided that there would be a signal for if something went wrong, where he would use his radio in the car and long press the talk button 2 times to signal that like something wasn't right. And it's a good thing that they had come up with this signal, because just moments after they had discussed the signal, according to the person that he'd talked about it with, Grant would have to use this signal. They said that things didn't quite feel right because the 2 passengers were allegedly acting shady, sharing glances at each other, looked like one of them was hiding something under his jacket. Well, the one of them that was hiding something was Kelbach, and the thing that he was hiding was a gun. Because as they got closer to their location, he leaned forward to the driver's seat and held the gun to Grant's head. He told him to give him all the money he had, which was only $9. None of these were really high-value robberies. But, Grant handed over the money, and once he had the money, Kelbach shot him. He later said in an interview that, quote, "I just pulled the trigger and blood flew everywhere." He went on to say, quote, "Oh boy, I never seen so much blood." Which says a lot to me about him. There's no regret or remorse in that statement. It's just kind of like almost excitement. Ugh. I don't like it. So the police actually were on their way to their location when this happened. Grant had used his signal to alert his supervisor and other taxi cabs nearby that there was an issue, and everyone was on their way to him or where they thought he was. He would be discovered by another taxi cab driver, but unfortunately he was already dead on the scene. By the time anyone arrived at the crime scene, the pair had already moved on from the scene, and they were on their way to a bar called Lolly's Tavern. Now, it's not really known if they chose this location before it happened or if it was just out of convenience, or really what their motive was in going there. But the 2 walked into the bar. It wasn't very crowded. There were only 5 patrons and then the bartender that were in the bar. Witnesses would later tell police that when they walked in, Kelbach went over and started fiddling with a pinball machine that was near the bar. And Lance would walk up to a patron in the bar named James Sizemore, who was 47 years old, and calmly pull out a gun and shoot him in the head. Just like that. Just walked into the bar, pulled out a gun, and shot somebody in the head. He then turned his gun on the bartender and informed the shocked people that were in the bar that, quote, "This is a stick-up." Which would make it seem like they were just there for money, right? So the bartender responded by pulling out the cash. Again, there were some conflicting reports here on what he did with it. I saw a few reports that said that Lance actually made one of the patrons from the bar place the cash into his pockets. Other reports say that he put it into his pockets himself, while Kelbach had pulled out his gun and was keeping the people, from trying to take advantage or, like take advantage of that situation. But either way, they took all of the money from the bar, which was about $300. And once he had the money, he shot at the bartender, and I guess just grazed him. He then leaned over the bar and shot again, but missed. He didn't know this, though, because the bartender had fallen to the ground and played dead. At this point, he turned around and both men started shooting. They killed 2 of the patrons of the bar on the spot, 20-year-old Fred Lilly and 34-year-old Beverly Mace. Both died. They also wounded another patron at the bar, and the final patron fell. He said it was from the concussion or the concussive shock of the bullets being fired, that he was nearly missed or something to that effect. But he had fallen down and laid there playing dead, so they thought that they had killed him too. It wasn't like they were, I guess, shooting at each individual. They were just firing. So at this point, thinking that everyone was dead, Kelbach and Lance began to flee the bar. As they left, or as they kind of turned around and were distracted, the bartender grabbed a gun that was hidden under the counter of the bar and started to shoot at them. They ran and were not hit by any of the shots, but this did cause them to flee on foot instead of trying to hail another taxi, potentially saving another cabbie's life that night. They fled to their car and started to drive out of the city. But at this point, police were already aware that something was going on, and the patrons of the bar quickly called the police and, for medical help for the people who had been injured. The one injured patron and the bartender were taken to the hospital where they both recovered. And police set up roadblocks or barricades where they would stop every car that went past to try to catch the 2 men, because now they had witnesses and they had a description. At this point, I don't think that they had connected what had happened on the 21st to the other 2 murders, but whoever these people were, they knew they had killed at least 4 people, so they were looking to stop them. Lance and Kelbach had made their way to their car and were fleeing when they were stopped by a police barricade. The officer who arrested them pretty much knew immediately that they were the people he was looking for. He approached the car and saw Kelbach and asked him to place his hands on the wheel, according to the officer. When Kelbach didn't respond immediately, the officer pulled out his gun, held it to the side of his head, and said again, "I need you to place your hands on the wheel. You're under arrest." And both men were arrested at that point. They were each charged and convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder. They weren't the same 5 deaths, and I wasn't able to find which person was specifically charged with which murder, but my best guess would be that one each was charged with the gas station attendants, Steve and Michael, because it was very specific of which one had killed them, and that for the 4 murders that happened on the night of the 21st, because they were both so actively involved, that they were both charged. But like I said, that is my guess based on what I read, or my assumption based on what I read. But both men were convicted, like I said, and sentenced to death in 1967. It was a very quick jury turnaround on this conviction. There really was no question that they had done it. Lance chose death by a firing squad, and Kelbach chose to be hanged. So they were so far into these proceedings that they had chosen their method of killing, which was a thing that you could do back then, I guess. But that's not the end of it. In 1968, there was a breakout at the Utah State Prison where both men were being kept. Actually, 23 violent offenders escaped from prison in this breakout, and this included Lance and Kelbach. Now, the 2 remained together when they escaped, which I don't know if that's the smartest plan, but hey. If the rumors were and things that I saw in reports were to be believed, they were finally reunited. They were lovers. Like I said, not confirmed. But they remained together and were captured together in Idaho about a week later. So they're recaptured, returned to jail, but in 1972, both men were still alive, and there was a case that was heard before the Supreme Court that was really important for Lance and Kelbach's cases. So it was the case of Furman versus Georgia. And basically what had happened in this case was Furman was convicted of murder and armed robbery, and he was sentenced to death for this. And he had appealed and taken it to the Supreme Court, basically saying that this was cruel and unusual punishment, which is not constitutional. The Supreme Court ruled in his favor, saying that he couldn't be sentenced to death for this. And because of this, they ended up overturning a lot of sentences for the death penalty, which included our two guys, Lance and Kelbach. So they were then resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, but they were removed from death row. Also in 1972, they were in the news a lot because it was very widely known that they were a sentence that could be overturned, right? So NBC chose to release a documentary, and documentary should almost be in air quotes here, that they had made of the two. This was before a lot of like true crime documentaries were a thing, right? So this documentary that they released was essentially an hour-long interview with the two convicted murderers. And it was recorded in 1969, but basically this interview was talking to the two of them about their lives. Who were you before you murdered 6 people in 5 days? They told about their childhoods and their lives and all of these things, but people didn't really like it. They didn't focus at all on the victims or on the crimes committed. It seemed like, the interview was these people, or the perpetrators' chance to try to humanize themselves and get the public on their side, which should not have been the case because there was no question as to the fact that they had murdered these people. So the documentary is actually not available online or anywhere that I was able to find to watch. And there's really not a lot of transcripts from it that are out there either. I spent a lot of time looking for it and was only able to find a few quotes or like little clips that were used in an ABC report done last year to talk about them as the first serial killers in Utah. But I believe that a lot of the reports of the two's drug use during the crimes, which I've seen it reported that they were high or somehow hopped up on pills and alcohol in every single crime that was committed. And also the relationship between the two was covered a lot in this documentary. So I believe that that's where it came from. Since I can't watch it, I can't confirm that for you. So after all of this went down, the two men went back to prison. And they really weren't heard from much again until 1992. In 1992, they were up for parole. And there was actually a parole hearing, which was shocking to me that, only 20 years later, these people who were sentenced to life in prison could have, maybe been paroled. The victims' families came to the hearing, and only one family actually spoke in front of the two killers. The rest of them chose to speak to the parole board without the killers being in the room. I think it was a fear thing. I mean, I would have been afraid. But they pleaded with the parole board, like, do not release these men. These are dangerous criminals. They're murderers. They're a danger to the public. We don't feel safe with them not in prison. They need to be punished for what they did to our families. And in the hearing, Lance actually said, he was asked by the parole board, what would you do if you were in our position? And he told them that he didn't expect them to that the two would be released, and that he believed this was a waste of everyone's time. It seems like Kelbach didn't agree, because immediately after parole was denied, he filed an appeal to the state Supreme Court of Utah, claiming that his sentence should be overturned. He claimed that, number one, he was denied the right to be tried before a representative jury, which I believe is relating to the fact that there was a second sentencing hearing. He said, number two, the trial court, quote, lost jurisdiction over him because it did not immediately resentence him to life imprisonment. It took some time for them to go through the process and then resentence. And that number three, he was improperly sentenced to life imprisonment under a penalty provision that it was not in effect at the time that he committed the murders. Basically, he was saying, because my initial sentence was unconstitutional, but this rule that was created, or, you know, the thing that was created because of this ruling wasn't in effect when I committed my crime, so I shouldn't be held to it. Feels pretty backwards, right? But he was really trying to get out. His appeal was denied. And the Chief Justice Zimmerman put a pretty strong statement out about why it was denied. He was very firm that you are going to die in prison, without actually saying that, because Chief Justices can't say that. He did. He lived the rest of his life in prison. Lance was the first of the two to die, passing away in 2010 in prison. Kelbach would die in August of 2018. These two men have widely been called the first serial killers in Utah, but there are some that say that's not true. And the reason that they say that is because this was a spree killing, not necessarily serial killers. Serial killers tend to keep the same MO with multiple victims over an extended period of time. Versus this, the two kind of went on a killing spree. There's not really a lot of indication as to what triggered this, or if there was escalation before this. They were both convicted criminals before it started. But once it started, things just like went at high speed until they were caught, basically. Either way, they're not good people, and I'm pretty good with the decision for them to both have spent the rest of their lives in prison. It's actually an interesting stat because Kelbach is one of the longest prison sentences ever. He was in prison for 51 years before his death. I totally encourage you guys to go out and do your own research on this. I'm going to warn you, if you want to learn more about this case, there are a lot of kind of sketchy blog posts and things out there about it. Just not a lot of substantiated claims. If you go back and read what was actually in the newspapers, that was what I tried to stick to here, especially when it came to facts, dates, etc. Like I said, there was never anywhere substantiated that confirmed that the two men were in a relationship, or about the drugs that were used by the two men on the nights of the murders. So I'll let you form your own opinions about that. I feel like you almost have to be, especially for that last night when they killed 4 people in a night and just the way that it happened. But that's my opinion. So what do you guys think? Do you like it when I cover cases that are a little less well known, or would you prefer me to stick to some of the bigger, like, oh my god, kind of cases? Not that this wasn't that way, to be clear. But let me know in the comments. And if you made it this far and you're not subscribed, you should definitely hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to give me a thumbs up if you liked it. Or a thumbs down if you didn't, I guess. But hopefully you did. Alright guys, I hope you have a great weekend and a great week next week. And I will see you next Friday.